Good afternoon, good evening, or morning, wherever you are. My name is Gary Pierre. I'm the founder and publisher of the Haitian Times. Thanks for being here. The New York Times has played a profound and influential role in my career. It was there that I elevated my skills working with some of the most talented journalists of my generation. Every day, I try to bring some of the best practices I learned there to the Haitian Times, knowing that mission at times is purely aspirational. I'm immensely proud to bring some of the journalists who spent more than a year working on the Ransom, a seminal work chronicling parts of Haiti's history, to give us a peek behind the window at arguably the most powerful news organization in the world. I'm pleased to introduce Michael Vigneault, née Jean-Francois, who will moderate this conversation. I can tell you that Michael attended Baruch College, that she started her career with the Haitian Times, and went on to work at the South Florida Sun Sentinel. I can also tell you that she earned an MBA from Florida International University, and that she had a long career as a communication specialist, including stints at Disney World. Above all, Michael V is a prodigal daughter who has returned to her community to lead the Haitian Times at an exciting and important moment in the publication's nearly 25 years of existence. At the end of the conversation, I will come back with some closing remarks. Please welcome Michael V.
Thank you, Gary, for the very kind words. It's always a pleasure, and I'm so proud anytime we get to do these community conversations. As Gary said, my name is Michael Vigneault. I go by Mac sometimes, and I'm coming to you from New York in my role as the executive editor at the Haitian Times. So welcome, everyone. Thank you, all panelists, for joining us today. So in this conversation, we'd really like to look at, how the New York Times came to produce the seminal piece, as Gary called it, for us to really dig into the history of Haiti. For ages, we've had so many scholars, journalists, authors tell us that Haiti was punished by the Western powers, retaliated against for having the audacity, the temerity to become the first Black republic in 1804. And so because of this refusal to fully recognize Haiti as a sovereign state and grant it the full diplomatic status that it needed to really carry the country forward, Haiti plunged decade after decade further into destitution. And so a lot of us have known the story for some time. And last month, when the New York Times released the story in the thick of Haitian Heritage Month celebrations, it was like a collective, this like sigh of relief came out, to have this validation, to look at this piece, all 30,000 words of it, that was being brought to new audiences outside of, select groups who love and care about Haiti. And so we'll look at the Ransom today. It's really an enormous work told in 5 chapters. Chapter 1, The Root of Haiti's Misery, Reparations to Enslavers, looks at the 150 million franc payment that Haiti was forced to make to France. It's what we refer to as the double debt. Chapter 2, Haiti's Lost Billions, explores the estimated 21 billion to 115 billion in lost economic growth this debt payment caused Haiti as a consequence. Chapter 3, How a French Bank Captured Haiti, really focuses on the loan terms that the Crédit Industriel et Commercial, the CIC bank, really used to extract these funds from Haiti. Chapter 4, Invade Haiti, Wall Street Urge, looks at how the US further pillaged Haiti's coffers in the 1900s. And finally, Chapter 5, Demanding Reparations and Ending Up in Exile, tells part of the story of former President Jean-Bertrand Aristide's role in demanding that France give back the money to Haiti. And so besides showing us the receipts, literally, the New York Times story carries this sort of like what if tone to it throughout, It makes you wonder as you're reading the piece, what if, this debt never happened? What if people in Haiti would be living differently? What if all these crises that we experience constantly could have been prevented if this payment had never been made? I think it also makes us wonder, what now? What can we do as a diaspora? What can we demand from the French descendants of the people who benefited from this money? What can we do? And so today on Juneteenth, a day that we commemorate in the United States, where the cost of freedom is top of mind for people. We thought it made sense to bring this conversation to you. I will get started right away with part one, the genesis of the story, with Catherine Porter and Greg Winter of the New York Times. I'll bring in the other speakers as they join the conversation. But first, let's go to Catherine, who is the Toronto bureau chief at the New York Times. She has reported from Haiti for more than 24 times and is the author of a book about the country called A Girl Named Lovely. Catherine, please tell us how the idea of the story came to be and your role in it.
Thanks for that great introduction, Mac. So I would consider myself, like you said, a lover of Haiti. Among that group of people, I started going to Haiti right after the earthquake in 2010 and continued to visit very regularly, mostly for reporting trips, but I have also gone with my children to visit close friends and family that I considered extended family of mine there now. And I don't think that as a reporter who lives outside as a foreign correspondent, you can spend that much time in Haiti without starting to ask these deeper questions as to why. Why does a country look the way that it does? Why is the infrastructure so feeble? And, the answer that you normally hear is corruption. And there's certainly been a lot of very strong reporting on that. But I started to hear and mostly read in history books. And as I was continuing to travel to Haiti, I started picking up more and more books about the country because I was so interested I am so interested in Haiti. And I read about the double debt. But I have to say, the more I read, first of all, the independence debt is so shocking in and of itself as a concept that you can't read it once without being really shocked by this. It's a complete opposite of reparations as we know and think of today. But what interested me most is how much this impacted Haiti and what effect it would have had on its development. And while I read quite a bit about it as a theme, I couldn't find anything that was forensic, that was really deeply based on how much money exactly did Haiti pay. I read that it had taken these loans from banks. There were interest fees, there were late fees, but there was no tabulation. And also how much of its annual budget, national budget, did this take up? Some books I read said 80%, other books said 20%. I was really intrigued, but as a journalist, as a single journalist at the Times, my own interest might have only taken me so far. It was really editors that decided to invest so deeply in not just having me research this, but another 3 colleagues to spend the amount of time. So I guess I would ask Greg to answer the second part of your question as to why the New York Times decided to invest this deeply into it.
That would be great. Greg is the international managing editor at the New York Times, and he oversaw the development of the project from ideation all the way through the release. Thanks, Catherine, for sharing that experience with us. Let's go to Greg for the second part.
Thanks, Mac. And thanks for doing this, Gary and Mac and everybody on this call, and Fido for the incredible translation work that you did throughout the project. He was really a great partner in this as well as the reporters here. The reason I think is simple. First of all, the double debt is, as Catherine mentioned, an incredible conceptual story that the world has really never seen before and never seen since, right? So, and Haiti is a country that we have covered diligently over the years from many, many different angles, but never have we dived into this question of why is Haiti always in this perpetual state of crisis, and how much of it can be traced back to this, the legacy of the double debt. And it was clear that, Catherine is a fantastic reporter who was going to lead our efforts on the ground in Haiti in terms of finding and talking to the farmers and working to track down the descendants of the people who had gotten those indemnity payments or quote unquote reparations payments in France. But this was a sprawling, huge project that we wanted to track down original documents in France and in the United States or wherever else we could find them. So that's how Constant came on board and Salam came on board. And also a colleague that Salam works closely with in Europe, Matapuzzo. And as they began to dig, our efforts became more ambitious. So, and as they found these original documents in long forgotten archives in France, Constant, and you should talk about this, Constant and Matt started to ask the question, well, can we actually tabulate from documents and original records the amount that Haiti actually paid? And if we can actually add up how much Haiti paid, can we then talk to economists? And luckily, Constant is an economist by training. Can we talk to economists and project what this would mean in lost economic growth and opportunity over the course of 2 centuries, right? These bigger questions. And Salam, for instance, Salam was digging into, the US role. And initially we weren't clear, are we going to do one story, more stories? And I thought maybe we could do one big overarching story, which is the first part that you mentioned. But Salam kept turning up such great things about the American role and, the American role and the impact of the American occupation that she said, this should really be a separate story. And I said, okay, let's see what you got. And if it holds together. And Matapuzzo said what turned up so much about CIC and its role in really exploiting opportunities in Haiti that he said, we should do this as a separate story. I said, okay, let's see what you got. As you know, Mac, our job is not to say no to ambitious reporters. Our job is to say yes, and how can you do it? And does it hold up when you've done it?
Right. So that's really, you have some key points, and I'd love to go to Salam and Constant to talk some more about the paper trail and, finding out all of these great pieces of information. But before we go there, Greg, I wanted to touch really quickly on something you said, that can you give us a sense of the timeline that this took and just like the cost, if you've calculated that, of actually putting something like this together in terms of resources?
Yeah, and this fits into something that I know people are wondering: why did we publish when we publish? Right? Why? What was the secret behind our desire and our decision to release it? And yes, we were aware of Haitian Heritage Month, but that wasn't really the driving factor. That was an added bonus. That was the icing on the cake. Really, we began this discussion with Catherine before the pandemic. It was, I can't remember exactly which disaster had occurred in Haiti. It was certainly well before the assassination, but I think it was one of the natural disasters. And we asked the question, so can we dive into what is behind the seeming misfortune that keeps coming barreling Haiti's way? And she said, I want to really dive into the double debt. We said, go for it. That, however, got severely delayed by the pandemic, in which we began a lot of the archival research to the extent that we could. Only after the pandemic was Catherine able to get back onto the ground in Haiti, really in early 2021. And at that point, Constant, Salam, and Matapuzzo, the other colleagues, were well underway with their historical research. We were actually ready to go by the early part of 2022, and I said, "Okay, we have a date picked out. We're going to go. The only thing that could have possibly derail us is if Russia invades Ukraine." Because at that point, the whole world will be focused on that conflict, and no one is going to want to read 30,000 words on 200 years of Haitian history when they're trying to figure out, are we entering a new nuclear conflict? So exactly when we could find the space to capture, because what we wanted to do is spark a conversation. We wanted to release this into the world so that the world could consume this information and begin to discuss Haiti. And we didn't think that that was possible at the moment of the invasion. So we waited a few months and picked when we felt like reader day-to-day interest in Ukraine was subsiding enough so that people could pay attention to something else as well. And so we randomly picked really the, late May when we thought we could do a special section. And that's the reason. There's no grand reason beyond that.
Well, there you have it, everyone. For all of you who asked, why now? Is this a special tribute for Haitian Heritage Month? It's all just coincidence. So let's go over to Constant and Salam to talk about, how they came upon some of these, the forensic evidence, as it were, that Catherine mentioned, and how it felt to just, land on something that was just mind-blowing while you were doing that. And then we'll hear from Catherine again about actually going to Dondon in northern Haiti and talking to the coffee farmers and different people there. I think, Constant, I see you first. So take it away with the research you did.
Right. Thanks, Mac. Catherine told you already that initially we thought that we would be able to find some figures or maybe some solid estimates in books or in research articles. So I'll be very honest. Initially, our plan was not specifically to hammer down this big figure, those big estimates. But eventually, as we read books, as we read those research articles, we found only stray figures, and we also realized that historians actually disagreed on how long the payments had lasted, how much had been paid each year. And so it was really impossible to understand how much had been paid. And because that was impossible, it was also impossible to try to estimate what was the long-term opportunity cost for Haiti, which was also one of our goals. So we just decided to collect the data ourselves. And we spent months going to archives in France, in Haiti, in the US as well. We talked to a lot of historians who helped us identify which archive would be useful for us. You were asking, what was our feeling when we found some key figures or documents? Well, I remember one time we went to an archive center in northern France with my colleague Matt Puzo. There was a banking historian who had pointed us to that archive, just saying, you should actually go there and see what you find. We literally did not know what we would find. Maybe the archivist would just bring us a letter. And he eventually came with 10 boxes full of documents. And we spent the entire afternoon there. And this is when we actually started to piece together the story of CIC and Haiti, because we had all of the financial records of the National Bank of Haiti, which was actually run by CIC and its partners. So this was that kind of surprise that happened, several times in archival centers in Paris as well. So going back to the figures, we gradually found the figures on the double debt. We started a spreadsheet, which we filled out cell by cell. We tried to cross-check each figure as much as possible. In terms of sources that we have used, we, as I said, used a lot of sources in the archives. We went to the diplomatic archives in France, where you could find a lot of letters from French diplomats that were kind of fulminating actually against Haiti's late payments. But that actually proved very useful, to have numbers for specific years. We went to another archive that is the archive of the Caisse des dépôts et consignations, which is this public French bank that collected most of the payments. We also used books by Haitian economists and historians, books by Frédéric Marcelin, for instance, who was a Haitian finance minister in the late 19th century. And he was also a vocal opponent of French control of Haiti's finances. And that was really crucial. So all in all, we just needed a bit of patience, a bit of hard work. We also worked a lot with historians to cross-check the figures. They provided us with a lot of context so that we could understand why on that specific year, Haiti, for instance, stopped the payments and then resumed them 3 years later. And after several months of work on this, I think we had pretty decent picture of what the debt was about. And this is when we started calculating the opportunity cost. But I think we'll discuss that a little bit later.
Right, right. Let's hear from Salam a little bit about what she found on the US side, as Greg mentioned.
Thank you for having us on this panel today. On the US side, we faced a bit of a problem just because of the pandemic. The National Archives were closed, and it was not that easy to find the documents because we couldn't go in there. Fortunately for us, the University of Florida has digitized many of the archival materials that we would have referred to in the Library of Congress or elsewhere, and those were really helpful. And we built on the work of scholars like Peter James Hudson, who'd written the book Bankers and Empire, which we found extremely useful for our investigation on the US side. And eventually we were fortunate enough to refer to some documents in the Library of Congress. There's been quite a lot written about the US occupation of Haiti over the more than a century since it has happened. I think our goal in that case was to sort of continue the work that Constant and Matt were doing on the French side and sort of try to get to the empirical calculations of how much money, for example, was being taken away from Haiti's national bank and its government resources in order to pay debts to New York banks. And we were able to piece that together from about 24 financial reports that the American administrators had been filing during the years of the occupation and afterwards. And we came to understand that the occupation officially may have ended in 1934, but the financial control continued for more than 13 years after that. So that was the US part of the story.
Thank you for that recap, Salam. And I should mention how amazing it is that, Salam, you're in London. I didn't mention this in the intro, but you're an investigative reporter based in London, previously worked with as a data and enterprise reporter with Reuters, where you covered migration to Europe and the war in Yemen. It's really amazing that, you are in London, Constant is in Paris, where he is based, and you are all able to just work in the middle of a pandemic, through all these digital archives and uncover all this amazing information. So, I'm just blown away by how you all were able to do it. So Catherine, I believe you are in Canada during this time, unable to go to Haiti to actually interview people about this. So talk to us a little bit about that and what it was like to finally get down there to Haiti with all of this information that your team, the rest of the team, had helped to surface.
I actually went when I first pitched the story, and Greg and our boss Michael Slotcom said yes, do it. So I went in January 2020, and I actually interviewed Jovenel Moïse about the double debt at that time and other people, but I was just going to sort of get the lay of the land. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. I was supposed to go to Haiti a second trip on March 30th, which is when Canada completely shut down. And I remember Greg and I were having this discussion back then. I don't know if you remember this, Greg, where I was like, should I go? Should I go? You're like, you should go. Maybe you should go. What do you think? I'm like, well, I could just spend an extra couple weeks there. My God, I'm so glad that I didn't do that, because I would have been in Haiti for, I don't know. Canada was completely shut, so I wouldn't have made it back. Anyway, then I went back in 2022.
2021.
2021. Right. Sorry, it's 2021. Yeah. I went back in 2021. Obviously, there was a big news story in 2021 with the assassination of Jovenel Moïse. So I worked on that also. But by then I had done enough reading on, and we had all done enough understanding about how this debt had been paid and how it had been done, mostly through coffee taxes, that after the revolution, the number one export, and almost before the revolution, but the number one export of Haiti was coffee, and that it was grown on these small subsistence farms that were 2 or 3 acres large, that at first at least were mostly in the north. There were also quite a few in the south, in the Grand Anse, and now there's a lot around the area of Chiot. But Don Don interested me most because that's where the first coffee plantations were cut. That was where coffee was started in terms of the commercial exportation of coffee. And so when you read these old colonial writers, they write about Don Don. So, and they still have a fairly vibrant coffee cooperative culture. There's 4 cooperatives in Don Don. So, and it's right under the Citadel, it's in the shadow of the Citadel. And to be honest, you know, I would have loved to have gone to Chiot too, to look at the coffee, because coffee is much more viable in terms of an export there. But the road to Chiot is very, very dangerous now. It goes through Bouquet, and it wasn't worth the risk to take that road. So Don Don, so I went up and I went on 2 trips to Don Don. I met with a number of farmers with two different cooperatives there, both named after, one is named after Vincent Auger, and the other is after Gabert le Vaillant, another revolutionary hero. And what was amazing to me there, I mean, first of all, it's so green. It's like it's a town based in a garden. And most people have some relationship to coffee. If they don't work coffee themselves, someone in their family is in the coffee. They might also be a school teacher, but they have a coffee farm. And I spent quite a bit of time just talking and seeing different coffee farms. And the thing, you know, it was amazing that you would talk to people and they're like, yeah, my family has farmed this land since the revolution. This has been in my family, you know. But when I talked about the double debt, very, very few people knew about it. In fact, I spent one afternoon at the Vincent Auger cooperative as people were delivering their coffee beans in the evening just before it closed, basically doing an informal survey of every single person that came in to say, like, have you heard about the double debt? Have you heard about the independence debt? What do you think about it? And that one day I talked to, I think, 40 people, and only 2 had heard of the double debt. And I think that's, you know, and some who had heard of it, they have big problems. But in that region, while incredibly beautiful, the natural beauty is really astounding. You know, Vincent Auger is a cooperative. No one in that region has electricity. They collect water from local stream sources that they, you know, that are just natural streams. People cook in their kitchens are like the country paysan kitchen with your little four, like in your, you know, either with coal, but most of them it's with wood. And you can really see visibly that people, while their homes are likely much better constructed than they were 100 or 200 years ago, the state infrastructure has not improved. The roads are mud roads, or they're not pavé at all. And you can really sort of cast your mind back there and imagine what it looks like 200 years ago, and try and understand that idea of the opportunity cost is very present in a place like Don Don, particularly in the section of Don Don where the Vincent Auger cooperative is called Matador, because that one has never had electricity. You know, it has never had paved roads. It has never had, no one has ever had robinettes in their homes. Mm-hmm. And most of the people I talked to would say that, particularly if they're over 50, that they didn't make it very far in school because their family couldn't afford schools. And schools in the area, while there is now a secondary school that's public, is fairly recent.
Mm-hmm. Catherine, I'm curious to know if when you spoke with, Jovenel Moise, had you had a chance to bring all of this link to him when you in your conversation, or not just yet, right?
Oh, that was like my first trip. I had only started to read, I didn't get any depth with him. And to be honest, he was very interested in talking less about the debt and more about the what he called the sort of the vultures in power, which was the theme of his government. But later, when I did go back, I was able to meet with Jean Bertrand Aristide and talk to him about the double bond.
Right. And we'll get into that a little bit later. I'm curious now, we want to bring in Fido into the conversation as the translator who helped put all of this together in Creole. Greg, or do you want to talk a little bit about why it was so important to have Creole be an available language for people to consume this in? And then we'll hear from Fido about what, this was like to actually be a part of it. Like, how important, Greg, was it to make sure this story was told in Creole?
Well, that was obvious to us that this story, what we were trying to do is unearth history and also advance, if we can, advance elements of this history for the entire world to discuss, but particularly, obviously, also for Haitians, right? And knowing the importance of Creole, or specifically Haitian Creole, to the conversations in Haiti, we knew that that was important. So Fido, at the risk of embarrassing you, we started asking around. It was like, who's the best translator on this that we could find? And your name came up repeatedly. And so that's how we approached him. So take it away, Fido. I don't think we realized exactly what we were doing to him by asking him to translate, 30,000 words, but, he managed to pull it off.
Right. So Fido, while you hop on, let me just introduce you really quickly. Fido Boyer, Fido is the founder and general manager of Creole Trends. It's a translation and interpretation agency based in Miami, Florida. He's worked on a ton of this type of work for local and national organizations. And so he translates in Creole, Haitian Creole, Spanish language, all of it. So Fido, tell us about what it was like to be brought into this project.
Well, thank you so much for choosing me out of all the Creole translators out there. And I hope I lived up to the hype. It was really totally it took us by surprise, because we had no idea the article was going to be published. And when we were given the scope of the work, we had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. So it was really a one-of-a-kind type of project. We've worked on other projects before, with book publishers and nonprofit organizations that are publishing maybe a newsletter of some kind, but something of that magnitude, with that much importance, and the constant re-editing that really drove us, crazy, because when a client gives us a document to translate, it's pretty much done. They don't do much to it. But I had no idea how this world, the newspaper world, operated until we got our both of our feet into one shoe into that into this project. So it was quite an interesting.
But how did it feel?
Fido and I were up till 2 a.m. 2 nights in a row, going over last minute edits. We spent a lot of time, and I was like, I'm really sorry. There's been another edit. We have to go through these 2 paragraphs again. And we literally were just talking, the last week into the wee hours of the morning, many nights in a row.
Exactly. And sometimes it almost felt, as my wife was walking around, it almost felt like the commercial, like the Jake from State Farm commercial, where he's on the phone at 2 a.m. talking to his agent. And so your agent is on at 2 a.m.
Yeah.
So that's how it felt like.
Yeah, but as a Haitian American, right, Fido? How did it feel to be a part of the subject matter in particular? Can you talk a little bit about that? Like the fact that this was going to be published to millions of people around the world, the story that so many of us had been familiar with. How did that feel?
Well, you're right. I mean, most of the projects we do, we work for the Mormons who are going to Haiti. So we look at all of the project as a project, and we look at it as a job to do, very independent, with as a very independent, translator. Most translators are pretty independent, to begin with in their work. But as because we've had to reread this work so many times, and because of the fact that I'm Haitian and most of us are, at some point it really, it gets to you. It tells you something that you haven't heard before. The forensic work that Constant and Salam has done really brought it to light for us, personally, for me personally. I've heard of the double debt before. I've heard of but no one has really, for me, done a job where they pinpointed where the money came from. I've been to Dondon many times. I've seen the coffee plantations. I've seen the people, but I had no idea they were the ones who paid for this. Their tax dollar. I mean, they're the tax that they put on the coffee export paid for this. So it really touches in a way that no other project has touched us in the past.
I bet it has. It's touched so many people all around the globe. And we've gotten so many, letters to the editor at the Haitian Times about this, and it wasn't even our story, right? And so I've seen the discussions on the New York Times website, the hundreds and thousands of comments. So I'm really curious, Greg, to know what that reception felt like. Did you expect it to be this volume, right? And the things that people were saying, both great and critical. How did that feel to have that reception come from around the globe, Greg?
To be perfectly honest, it was way beyond my expectations. And it's not that it was beyond my hopes, because whenever you're investing a lot of effort into any piece of journalism, as you know, you want to get the most amount of readers as possible. And this one, we were obviously investing an unusual amount of resources that we felt was really important in order to go deep on a subject that we all have wondered about and cared about. But with the Ukraine war, with the subject matter of, honestly, Haitian poverty, which many of our readers don't necessarily care that much about, or they tired of it. There's always this compassion fatigue that I think you as journalists are aware of, that people who are not directly touched by this information feel like, okay, yes, Haiti has problems. Okay, what else is new, right? And we tried to do it in ways to break through that in many ways. First of all, I felt it was very important to make the story as much about, it's of course about this grand inequality and grand inequity of epic proportions, but it's also a story about coffee. So we tried to write it in a way that, people don't even know, and this is why we started the story. People don't even know how coffee is grown, or that it's a cherry off of a tree. Doesn't come as a roasted bean. That people don't even know that, right? Basic things about something that they feel they all know and consume wildly. And yet it created this intense riches for people outside of Haiti, and virtually nothing for the people who were producing it. Did you know this about your morning drink? So we've had, I can't always give exact specifics, but we've had over 4 million people consuming these stories across the board in different ways. And that doesn't include the people who read it in print. That's just digitally. It was more than our stories about the assassinations, Now, those stories, like the story when we had the exclusive interview with Martine Moïse about how the gunman came in, and she had never told this story to anybody. And at the risk of giving away some metrics that I'm not supposed to share, I will do it anyway. But, you know, when Martine came out and told us the story of how these gunmen burst through her door and how she was hit and lay and played dead, and they came looking for a file, that was an outlandish story. No matter what you were interested in the world, that was a story that was something that people read. The story, however, about Haitian, you know, the ransom that Haiti paid to France for its independence, though 200 years old, though about, you know, going through history, had many, many times more readers than that story, than the story about Martine Moïse. And even the story about, you know, the hit list that was basically the hitmen came looking for when Moïse, when Jovenel was killed. Even that story didn't have as many readers as this. So we felt very, very gratified that people were paying attention to a big, complicated, meaty, substantive issue about the development and formation of Haiti.
Right.
And that was amazing.
Yeah, and you mentioned digitally, Greg, readers, but there are, you know, people in Haiti who are reading this over the radio in Creole, you know, thanks to the translation. So we're not even calculating that in the number.
We're not calculating. And to be honest, I think for all of us, the interest from the Haitian community, whether it's the diaspora or in Haiti, that to us is the most gratifying part of it. That, you know, that is our natural audience for this, as well as every citizen of the world. But we wanted to make sure that this was also information we were giving to Haiti in a way that could be used for whatever purposes going forward.
Right.
And so that's been the most gratifying.
That's really excellent to hear. No, we're running a little bit short on time, so I want to touch quickly on the impact that this investigation has had so far, right? You know, with the CIC Bank, for example, there's an investigation that they said they would form. Can you talk, Constant, Salam, and Catherine, about some of the changes that your reporting has led to just in the past month alone so far, or the response from, you know, people who are in a position to do things differently? I'll start with Constant, since the CIC is the most obvious in terms of impact.
Right. So about, I think there was 2 days after we published the series, the Crédit Mutuel, which is the bank that owns the CIC, published a statement saying that they would finance historical research into their past in Haiti. I must say that was actually quite surprising to me, because whenever it comes to issues related to France's colonial past, institutions in France rather decide not to respond or not to comment or not to react. So that was quite surprising that the CIC was so quick to react and to say that they would finance research. On the part of the French government, however, the French government has not reacted to the stories, except basically saying no comment. I mean, the reason for that, there are probably a lot of reasons, but I guess, you know, they probably don't want to bring too much attention maybe to the stories for obvious reasons. I think in France, in terms of impact, it's been covered a lot by the French news. There has been quite a lot of discussion also in historical circles. What was the most interesting to me was the discussion within economic and finance historians, who, after they read the story, said that this would probably prompt some historians to actually do more research into the colonial past of banks, such as CIC, but also other banks like BNP Paribas, for instance. That is quite interesting to me, because this is a history that we don't know much about in France. Despite the fact that many banks, many very big and powerful banks that still exist today in France are related to those sort of national banks in name only that were created in the 19th century in Haiti and in other former colonies of France. So, you know, if if this kind of, I would say, like archive journalism might prompt people and historians to get interested into these topics and do some more research about that, I think I'm very satisfied with this.
That's great. I know the scholars definitely were engaged with the way that the citations were done. There were some back and forth even about who should have been cited or not cited, even though you have a bibliography with thousands and thousands of names that we encourage everyone to go check out. So it would be wonderful to have just more research done into these banks, you know, that help raise funds for the great wonders of the world that we see today in the Western world. Let's go over to Salam and see what, Salam, what do you think about some of the impact or the reaction that you've seen so far from your reporting?
The reaction from the US generally has been very muted. We didn't get much of a response from Citigroup, parent company of National City Bank, which was heavily involved in Haiti. And we didn't hear from anyone within the US government about the occupation of Haiti back then. But for me, the biggest impact was when Catherine mentioned, and you yourself said earlier as well, that people are reading this to each other, reading this over the radio and sharing it in farming co-ops. That I have never experienced that as a journalist. And it was really heartening to hear people engaging with this in such a way. I come from Ethiopia and most of my family is in the rural parts of the country. So it is something that I can easily imagine and picture. And it was really, it was the biggest, greatest outcome that I could have hoped for from this project.
That's beautiful. I love that. Catherine, let's talk a little bit about just having that conversation with Jean-Bertrand Aristide in particular, right? In terms of impact. The story helps to frame as, this president who started demanding the return of the funds, right? And then he ends up in exile because friends just didn't want to do it, right? So what was that like? What have you seen or heard in terms of the reaction to that particular part of the series?
Well, I'm sure you've heard the same thing, very loudly. There's been politics in Haiti is bloody, so I've seen it being used on radio shows that are connected to Lavalas and Aristide's political party. There's been others that have asked me straight out as whether we support Jean-Bertrand Aristide as an institution, which we do not, and whether whether we put this out in order to influence the upcoming election. That is not the case either. I was really interested to interview Aristide. He very rarely gives interviews.
Right.
So just to get an interview with him seemed like a pretty big scoop in our world. And to get to spend some time talking to him about this. And also between Constant and I, we spent a lot of time going through his speeches. We met with people who were in his cabinet at the time. We met with a doctor who was a doctor in the United States, a Haitian doctor in the States, who had done his master's thesis on, had basically done as part of his master's thesis, looking at the double debt and trying to do the same thing we did, but doing it based on the 150 million francs reduced to 90 million, and then using an exchange rate and inflation from that basic. And he's super educated, really interesting. He now works for Aristide's medical school back in Haiti, but I spent time meeting with him. So that part of the story, I think, again, if you spend any time in Haiti and you talk to people about the double debt, most of them will know. In fact, people could tell me off the top of the head the 21 billion 640, whatever the number is, to the centime or the gourd, right? So I thought that was really amazing that there is this echo in the country that people remember around Aristide's campaign. And there certainly is, I would say, that in the telejol of Haiti, people will talk about, you know, oh, the French wanted him out, and that's why the coup happened. But things, of course, were more complicated than that. And the more research we did, we saw that yes, or Constant found that yes, you know, some of the former French ambassadors said, yeah, it played a role. It was not the definitive singular factor, but it played a role. Whereas the American ambassador will tell you it did not play a role, you know, that it was about, for him, it was about the growing civil war in the country, about, you know, about the militants that were coming down, you know, from, at that point, they were based in Cap Haitian and they were making their way down to Port-au-Prince, and that they were there to save his life.
I mean, all this actually, Catherine, just makes us all wonder, you know, what now, right, with this information? You've done what you set out to do, as Greg said, which was to spark a conversation about this history, right? And so we've wondered the same thing ourselves. Okay, this reporting is out there. More people are interested in this part of the story, you know, how it plays out in different parts of the globe. So I think, I know you guys can't really speak to anything in particular that advocates for one position or another, but you know, at the Haitian Times we can, because that's part of our editorial mission. So while I look through some of the questions, let me ask Gary actually to share some thoughts on what now, like what we're seeing some of the people who've responded to the story are trying to do or willing to do or wanting to do. And I'll just look for some questions in the meantime. Go ahead, Gary.
Well, I think the community is excited about the project and wants to move to action. And I, you know, like you said, we encourage that because that's part of what, you know, our role is. But I think there are several things we can do. I think we could first try to petition the Haitian government to use this information in the schools, part of the civic and history education curriculum, because it's really important that, you know, the young Haitians are coming up, understand the historical context in which they're growing up, so that, you know, there's sort of like self-shame, if you will, kind of dissipate a little bit. And so they can start working towards a better Haiti. Because at the end of the day, no matter how much we're passionate about, how much passion we bring to Haiti, it's the people in Haiti who have to lead this fight. But at the same time, we in the diaspora can do the same thing in Massachusetts, in Boston, in New York metropolitan area, South Florida, and in parts of Texas, that, you know, where we are growing in large numbers, that community in which we're evolving needs to have a glimpse of understanding of the community based in the reporting that the New York Times has done. Again, I know about the controversy surrounding sort of like the lack of credit and all that, but it's irrelevant as far as we're concerned. The information is accurate, it's legit, and it should be shared. And so this is what I'm urging all of you who want to take action. I mean, those are tangible things that you can do as a result and change the narrative, if you will, because this is a moment where we can seize on it and it says, okay, this is what happened. Now, what are we going to do moving forward? And I'd like to introduce you to Charles Edward Dennis. He's a Haitian American entrepreneur, and he, like many others, reached out to us and to ask what can be done. And they got together about 5 or 6 people, and they wrote a letter to the editor to the New York Times. And I'd like for him to read that letter for us.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Hello, Mike. Hello, Gary. Thank you very much. Hello, Gregory, Constant, Selam, Catherine, and Fido. My name is Charlotte Baldwin, as Gary introduced me. Member working in the Haitian diaspora and also investing in Haiti, trying to make Haiti a better place. So very happy, to be part of this and to be selected to actually share with you our appreciation. This story, more than 200 years old, could not be more relevant today. From the slave trade era to the triumph of Nelson Mandela, from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech to the presidency of Barack Obama, the Ransom highlights the noble struggle of Haiti's forefathers from the War of Independence to the stifling financial embargo endured for a century. So much progress has been made, yet the struggle remains against a modern form of slavery seen in the inequitable distribution of health and wealth, the detained rights to live in peace, and the lack of opportunities to improve our lives. In Haiti, these facts are not new. Many historians and politicians have addressed them, for countless reasons. What surprised us the most is the effort and dedication put forth by the New York Times to research the facts, discover scientific evidence, and compile quantitative data to support this thesis. And in doing so, the New York Times has sided with the Haitian people. We hope this alliance will help change the rhetoric about Haiti, if nothing else, from the poorest country in the hemisphere to the most noble struggle of our modern times and a beacon for the emancipation of humankind. 2 simple words of 8 unique letters will have to bear the weight of an entire nation's appreciation for your contribution. They are, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, guys.
Julie said, yep, we got that request to read it to you guys live because
Thank
people
you.
are so appreciative of the work that you've done. I know we only have time for like really one question. So the one I'll ask here is, to what extent did Haitians in Haiti, writers, authors, have a role in producing this work, the writers, reporters based in Haiti? I think either Catherine or Greg can take that one.
Catherine, do you want to talk about the people that we
Sure.
work with in Haiti and have through for years?
Sure. So we worked with quite a few historians in Haiti. I will say that there are some, like Georges Michel is a close friend of mine. I meet with him regularly, and he helped me find many other historians. We also hired, we hired 2 translators on the ground for interviewing people. I speak pretty good Creole, but to make sure that that I get it right, I always have a translator. And then we hired a historian named Charles Archin, who helped us go to the libraries and get the archival documents from Le Moniteur, so we could look at historically the proposed budgets of the Haitian government starting in 18. I think the first one we got from there it was actually after the fall of Boyer, in 43 on, that they were all published. We hired a journalist named Ricardo Lambert. He went through the archives at Le Nouvelliste, and also so in-house at the Nouvelliste, and also at one of the libraries, to find historical articles, mostly around 2003 and 2004, around Aristide's campaign. But there were some we asked him to go look for other years also, and he did that for us. And then who was the third? I'm trying to think. Oh, and then our regular translator. So a lot of the books, even this Marcelin book, we couldn't find it. We were lucky that I became friends with an archivist who's normally based in Haiti. He's now in Montreal. And there's a great library in Montreal. So he sent us scans of old books by Alain Tournier, and that we couldn't find. But our colleague Harold Isaac, who did a lot of work, has done work with us on many stories. He did work with us on this story. He went to people's private libraries to get books. Like, that's how we got Frederic Marcelin's book. And in fact, we discovered that it was so rare because Gusty Clary Gaillard was someone we talked to very regularly from the beginning up until the very end. Constant and I went through for hours with her through the spreadsheet, and she was really excited to see the Marcelin book, and she's like, please send it to it's so hard to find, please send it to me. So anyway, on the ground, that's who we worked with there.
It's really great to know that, because this story was done on multiple continents. So many different countries participated and had a role in helping it come to light. It's really beautiful, the interconnectedness of it all. But Catherine, you mentioned the archivists and forming relationships with them. Someone had a quick question, I hope a quick answer to that Constant can take on, right? Like, what was the archivist reactions, the gatekeepers of the French forensic material when you guys went to them, right? Did you meet any sort of resistance or lack of cooperation from people who wanted to maybe maintain the current narrative about France and Haiti?
Not at all. Not at all. I think they were actually quite happy that we would go in their archives and do some research. Archivists are historians. They're really happy if we can, advance the research on a history that's been buried or forgotten. I'll give you the example of the archives of the Caisse des dépôts et consignations, which is this French public bank that collected most of the payments on the double debt. The center is located in an upscale neighborhood in Paris, very near the Seine River, beautiful building of the 19th century, typical of Paris. I went there for about 4 or 5 days over the summer in 2021, and I was alone the whole time. And the archivist was extremely nice to me, helping me identify the documents, the boxes, keeping the boxes for me over months and months and months, asking me after maybe 7 months if he could actually send back the boxes to some sort of another building in central France where the boxes were kept. So I did not encounter any resistance at all. And I mean, from what I can tell about the reactions from historians and economists in France, I think they were actually quite interested and happy about our articles rather than resistant about what it revealed about French's past.
I think that sets up the stage for what we've been thinking about at the Haitian Times, which is, putting together the 1804 project, similar to the 1619 project, but we don't have the resources, obviously. So my question to Greg, Catherine, and the whole team is, do you have plans, or what plans are you thinking of to make sure that this gets out to more people all over the world once this initial reception dissipates?
It's a good question, and one we've been asking ourselves. First, what we've dealt with is requests for reprints of the articles. Mm-hmm. The ones that we're prioritizing are the ones inside Haiti, particularly requests from Le Nouvelliste to run the series in full. We gave it to them initially, but they couldn't run the entirety of it because they just didn't have the capacity. But I think after they saw it, they said, let's run the whole thing. And so we've been giving them the rights to do so. And also similar requests like that from schools or individuals who are trying to, spread the word in Haiti with the Haitian diaspora, giving them the rights to do so. So that's our first priority. There have been some requests for, should we turn this into a book? Should we, that's a question I'll have to ask some of the reporters who are probably already enmeshed in new things. But the question of where we go from here is very much in our minds. One thing that I think, the gentleman who joined us, who read the letter, Charles, one thing that he mentioned is something that when we're talking journalistically, what's next? Mm-hmm. One of the things is this question of, can we change the narrative, not just among the population at large or the world at large, but even journalistically? You'll notice, of course, and I think this is something that really rankles most Haitian Americans or Haitian diaspora or people in Haiti as well, that the shorthand journalistically is Haiti, the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere, suffered an earthquake or whatever, the story continues. The question then is, okay, what is that new second line, right? What is that new describer, right? Is it, the nation that overthrew, its French enslavers and defeated Napoleon's army? Is it the nation that paid, generations of payments to its former enslavers? That question of what is the new description that the world embraces for Haiti, in terms of that one that not only describes its current state, but the entire evolution of Haitian history to get there. That, I think, is a big question of what's next too, and how people, journalists included, rethink Haiti as a result of this.
Agreed. We can only, go talk on the different news programs about why Haiti is the way it is every time there's a new crisis. So I hope that, like you said, this has sparked a conversation. It's just the beginning of a new conversation to be had with audiences worldwide about Haiti. So again, we thank you for making time to come on today and talk with us about how you got the story, how you did it, and to really inspire all of us to take the ball and run with it going forward. Before we wrap up and just, share your socials and all of that, is there any one thing in particular each of the reporters would like to say about, being touched from what the story has done? Salam talked a little bit about it from the context of people in rural areas and everything else. But for Catherine, Constant, is there anything you'd like to add about just one single thing that stands out to you in terms of a personal reflection?
Wow. Well, I'm just thinking, by the way, the archivist is Patrick Tardieu. I should have named him too. One reaction, other than the coffee farmers reading it to one another, which also just very much makes me very happy. And that we are also in discussions of doing an audio version of the story in Creole, which makes me very happy. There's a group of community activist organizations, Haitian American in Miami, that are starting a book club, and they're meeting weekly with more than 1,000 members to each week read the stories to one another. And then they're inviting different historians to come in as they go. I've never worked on a story that has caused that kind of reaction. That's really heartwarming to me. And I've said this, the other thing for me is that when I was interviewing historians during the case, I interviewed this guy who's doing his PhD at Johns Hopkins on Saint-Domingue. And he said, I think about the independence debt every week. And I said, why do you think about it every week? Like, you do pre-Haitian independence, and this happened in 1825. Like, it doesn't work, like it's not part of your study area. And he said, I think about it because it makes me so angry that France gets to be the country of liberté, égalité, fraternité. And Haiti is a country of poverty, of corruption, of destitution. When really, this really, when it came to Haiti, France did not show any of those ideals. And in truth, Haiti should be known as the first Black country of the free Black country of the Americas that overthrew slavery, 7 decades before it happened in the United States. It's an amazing history. And so that framing for me, that just has always stuck in my mind.
Well, there's definitely an opportunity there that we're thinking about. We've, never referred to Haiti as the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere in our reporting. And it's really rankled us, over the years. We've done stories about that, in fact. So I'm taking the ball and running with it. And you might see a different descriptor for Haiti every time, just to give everyone some ideas on how to talk about Haiti moving forward. So
yes, when you do come up with your various boilerplates, I'd be super interested to see what you come up with. Yeah,
we'll send them your way, Greg, for sure. All right, we're way over time, but I want to thank everyone so much for joining us. We've learned a lot about the grit that it takes to put together something like this. the amount of people, the hard work, the teams, and more importantly, the willingness, right, of editors like Greg and his team to actually give reporters the green light to spend so much time and energy on reporting this story. And we hope to see more of that type of work around Haiti specifically over time. We are going to keep pushing for more and more of this because we need it, our nation needs it. And as Gary said, with the what now question, right? It's up to Haitians in Haiti, in the diaspora, to take this, continue having these conversations like the one Catherine mentions is taking place with the Miami Book Club, and really think differently, like change our mindsets around how we feel and are about being Haitians all around the globe. So again, thanks everybody. Please stay engaged. We will share the resources with you. I see a couple things asking, where can we read this? How can we continue to make sure people know this information? We will send you all of that if you registered on the Zoom link to get our follow-up communications. So stay tuned and be sure to follow the Haitian Times and the New York Times on our websites and all of our socials. Thank you again, everyone, so much. Catherine, Constant, Salam, Fido, Greg, Gary. Happy Freedom Day to everyone. Please continue this conversation today with everyone you meet on Juneteenth. Have a great one, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.